Hello there guys and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video we're going to be talking about critical hits, or more specifically lack thereof. And all in all, in Marvel Construct Champions, obviously this game is really complex and there are a lot of different abilities and some small minor details in many different champions that I feel can be quite frequently either overlooked or certainly underestimated, or at the very least some disadvantages occasionally, depending on node combinations, can be turned into advantages. But first and foremost, so what is critical hit? In Marvel Construct Champions, just like in most of the role-playing games and video games, critical hit is meant to symbolize kind of like a successful hit which basically deals more damage. And that is exactly what happens in Marvel Construct Champions. When you crit, you get those big yellow numbers, and when you crit, you basically can bypass a large portion of opponent's armor and deal extra damage. Now, that being said, there are a couple of champions in this game who physically cannot crit. It's in their ability set that they will never be able to land a critical hit. And at the first glance, it is certainly a major drawback. Now, we have Crossbones and we have Guillotine 2099, which are the only two champions in the game, to best of my knowledge, who are guaranteed never to crit. Now, in order to compensate for those crits, both of them have different abilities. For instance, Crossbones gains a Fury buff, which increases his damage output overall. Thus, his damage kind of like output is way more linear without these huge critical spikes. And we have Guillotine 2099, which instead of landing a critical hit, places Degeneration debuff, which is also a very interesting debuff because nothing is immune to it, and I might be discussing it in another video. But the point is, so the Kabam developers typically give some sort of extra ability to compensate. Now, the problem is that these extra abilities simply are not good enough to compensate for the lack of critical hits, because that is where a lot of damage comes out of these champions. And if you look at the fact that instead of critting, you just place a degen that deals nowhere near enough damage to kind of like effectively compensate for the lack of critical hits, or in case of Crossbones, instead of critting, you gain a Fury buff, which again doesn't really compensate for the lack of damage quite substantially enough to make the ability itself be amazing. However, the way not critting interacts with a lot of game modes, nodes, and different champions is very advantageous at many times, and it's important to know that there will be a lot of benefits from knowing that you will never land a crit. Especially because in the last couple of recent years, Kabam has been actively trying to quote-unquote punish you from landing critical hits, because we have champions like Ghost and Corvus who were reigning absolutely unchecked in Marvel Construct Champions, and they released many different champions who punish you or discourage you from landing critical hits or take away the advantage of it. Now, a couple of examples that we're going to go over really quickly. For instance, would include Havoc, because Havoc not only reduces the critical damage, therefore any champion that relies on landing big critical hits would be hindered by that ability, but additionally Havoc gains a plasma charge every time you land a critical hit on him, and that will result in him detonating these said plasma charges and dealing a whole chunk of damage to you. However, if you do not land any critical hits, you can completely ignore that ability, plus you don't have to care about your damage from critical hits being reduced, and that in itself already automatically makes you a decent Havoc counter. Now, in Guillotine 2099 case, yes, you also have the armor buff, which makes the fight complete breeze, but even Crossbones, who technically shouldn't be a good Havoc counter, can become one due to the fact that Havoc will gain his plasma charges much slower than he normally would against an average champion. And then after Havoc, we obviously have Mr. Sinister, who basically regenerates at least 70% of the damage dealt to him via critical hits. So in order to deal with him effectively, you typically want to either heal block him, rely on damage over time debuffs, which can be tricky because he can reflect them back at you, or you simply want to avoid critting in the first place, which is perfect for Crossbones and Guillotine 2099, because you never crit, so he never regenerates and he never gains the benefit of it. Another champion that does not necessarily punish you from critting, but simply takes away all advantage from crits would be Man-Thing, because critical hits deal no extra damage. So if you're using a champion that typically would rely or enjoy the benefits of critting frequently, Man-Thing completely nullifies it, and the best way to deal with Man-Thing in such occasions would be to rely on damage over time debuffs, or use a champion that's designed specifically not to crit and not to base any of his intended damage output in critical hits to begin with. So Man-Thing is another example how critical hits are basically actively getting discouraged from being relied upon. Additionally, from seeing a very significant increase of specific abilities in champions that basically punish or nullify the effectiveness of critical hits, we have seen an increase in champions that have specific base stats, and base stats include critical resistance. So for instance, against Dr. Doom, you are far less likely to land a critical hit with an average champion. Therefore, once again, a champion that's specifically designed not to rely on critical hits at all would have quite a decent time against Dr. Doom in his base kind of like fight, or any other champion who have these enhanced critical resistances. And then additionally, we have a new set of abilities which completely prevent you from critting, which we can see, for instance, in Warlock, which also basically states that if you have Warlock's armor up active, your special attacks will never be able to crit, thus you won't be able to deliver your optimum amount of damage. Now, all of these things have come to the game relatively recently, and therefore the abilities or the potential of champions who do not crit has increased largely due to that. And obviously there is a last component in form of nodes that also have been actively trying to discourage you from critting. For instance, in Act 6, we can see 90% crit resistance. So any champion that has, let's say, relatively decent crit rate and who is reliant on these critical hits to deliver damage will be heavily hindered. So you are left to basically use damage over time effects, absolutely 100% guaranteed crits, or champions whose skill sets have been formed around never critting in the first place. And obviously we have some old and some new nodes that again actively punish you from landing critical hits. Some of the worst and most annoying ones would be like terminal velocity, because every time you land a crit, opponent's power gain rate is increased and it goes up to 300%. So within a couple of combos, the fight is going to be almost unbearable if you are using a regular champion. So you are basically forced to resort to a champion that has extremely capable power control abilities, or a champion that never lands a crit, therefore completely ignores this node. Another node that can be quite annoying is spiked armor, because every time you land a critical hit, opponent gains more physical resistance, you take damage back, and it's just quite an annoying experience in the first place. However, again, Guillotine 2099, Crossbones, and potentially some more champions released in future who will also have ability never to land a crit will certainly benefit from it against these nodes. And then obviously we have Backblast, for instance. Backblast is another node that can be bypassed in multiple ways. For instance, you can use an Incinerate immune champion, and then you can enjoy the increased critical damage and don't have to worry about the Incinerate debuffs placed on you. However, there aren't that many Incinerate immune champions, and having more options to more different fights is always beneficial. And another way how to deal with Backblast is, once again, ignore it in the first place. Never land a critical hit, therefore you will never deal more than 5% of opponent's damage via a critical hit, and you will never get an Incinerate on yourself. So Guillotine 2099 and Crossbones can absolutely ignore Backblast as if it wasn't there in the first place. And lastly, and perhaps most significantly, we have Flow, which is a defensive tactic available in Alliance War from tier 5 and above, and it has pretty much single-handedly ruined everybody's Alliance War experience, or at least made it significantly more challenging and difficult, because the power gain opponents gain from Flow is incredible. It's so quick, you are made to feel like there is just no hope. You're gonna eat level 3 after level 3 up until such point where you die if you crit or are are unable to switch it off. Now, flow has recently been somewhat toned down because you not necessarily need to stun the opponent anymore. You need to land a well-timed block, which provides you an option to deal with the flow on the fights where opponents are in fact debuff or stun immune. So we're going to see whether flow is a lot easier than it used to be in prior seasons, because it was an absolute nightmare. However, Guillotine 2099 and Crossbones again completely ignore flow because they are guaranteed never to crit, and there is that important distinction from low crit rate to guaranteed crits and never to crit. Never critting is a kind of guaranteed ability that you can rely on and then can use to bypass many different nodes and gain advantage in different matchups, whereas inherently the abilities themselves that Crossbones and Guillotine 2099 has would not be enough to offset kind of like the disadvantages not having access to crit damage would place on these heroes. However, Kabam's active campaign to punish people for landing these critical hits has made it so that it is actually quite a desired ability. And yeah, hopefully this video has helped you guys. If it did, then definitely hit that like button, hit that sub button, hit all the buttons, and I will catch you guys soon. See ya.